Kalisa was a poor, orphaned girl who had known nothing but hardship her entire life. She had no family, no home, and no one to protect her. One day, she was sold like a piece of property to Bango, a ruthless desert lord whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of many. He was known for his cruelty and believed that kindness was a weakness only fools possessed. His eyes were cold and his voice was sharp, leaving no room for mercy. Kalisa, small and fragile looking, was dragged into his fortress, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. She had heard stories about Bango, how he conquered villages without blinking, how he punished even the smallest mistakes without remorse. Now, she was his property, and no one would dare save her. But deep inside, beneath her fear, a quiet flame of defiance began to flicker, though she didn't yet realize. Kalisa was forced into the life of a personal servant, waking before the sun and working until the moon rose high in the sky. Bango made sure her life was filled with nothing but suffering. He didn't just see her as a servant, he saw her as a symbol of weakness, something beneath him. He mocked her every move, calling her useless and pathetic. Whenever she stumbled under the weight of the heavy jugs of water she carried or dropped a plate from exhaustion, he laughed cruelly. His voice would boom through the grand halls of his fortress, and his men would join in, entertained by her misery. He made sure she ate only scraps, barely enough to keep her standing. Her clothes were nothing more than rags, torn and stained from endless days of cleaning the cold, dusty floors. Bango seemed to enjoy watching her struggle, believing it proved his power over her. He would sit on his throne, draped in silk and gold, watching her with a cruel smirk as she worked herself to the bone. When she moved too slowly, he'd knock over his goblet of wine, forcing her to clean the mess while the liquid burned her raw, blistered hands. Sometimes he would make her stand before his soldiers while he listed every reason she was worthless, too weak, too small, too stupid. His men laughed, throwing bits of bread at her like she was an animal. Kalisa wanted to cry, but she held back her tears. She didn't want to give him that satisfaction. Bango noticed her silence and hated it. He wanted to see her break, to see her beg for mercy, but Kalisa didn't beg. She stared at the ground, her fists clenched at her sides, swallowing her pain. Bango believed her silence meant she was too weak to fight back, too broken to resist him. He told himself that kindness made people soft, and he wanted Kalisa to understand that in his world, only the strong survived, and strength meant cruelty. He was certain she was too pathetic to ever defy him. He believed he had won, but what Bango didn't see was the fire slowly growing inside her. Each cruel word, each humiliation didn't weaken her spirit, it sharpened it. She didn't show it, but she remembered every insult, every moment of pain. Her hatred for Bango grew, not as a wild, reckless anger, but as something colder, steadier. She wouldn't break, no matter how much he wanted her to. Kalisa didn't understand why, but she felt the desert around her. The wind seemed to hum in her ears. The sand felt warm and alive beneath her feet. It was a quiet, strange comfort, a reminder that even in her suffering, she wasn't completely alone. Bango didn't notice. He was too busy convincing himself that Kalisa was nothing, just another weak, broken soul under his control. He saw only what he wanted to see, a helpless orphan girl who could never rise against him. He never imagined that the very desert he ruled over might have other plans, or that the girl he mocked could become something far more powerful than he could ever comprehend. Days blurred into nights for Kalisa, her body aching from endless work and her heart heavy with pain. But as much as Bango tried to crush her spirit, something deep inside her refused to die. And then the desert began to stir. It started with small, barely noticeable things. The wind shifting strangely when Kalisa walked through the courtyard, the sand swirling gently around her ankles as if it were alive. She thought it was nothing, a trick of her tired mind, but the whispers of the desert grew louder. One day, while she was scrubbing the stone floor of Bango's hall, a strong gust of wind burst through the open window, knocking over his golden goblet. The wine spilled everywhere, and Bango's face twisted with rage. He turned his fury on Kalisa, but before he could strike her, the wind blew harder, slamming the heavy doors shut, With a thunderous crash, the room fell into an eerie silence. Bango's hand hovered in the air, his eyes flickering with something he never showed: fear. Kalisa didn't understand what was happening, but she felt it. The desert was watching. As the days passed, stranger things followed. When Bango drank from his goblet, the water would vanish, leaving the cup bone dry. His throat burned with thirst, but no matter how many times his servants refilled it, the water disappeared the moment it touched his lip. His men whispered about curses, but Bango silenced them with threats. He refused to believe that a mere girl could have anything to do with it, yet the desert didn't stop. Kalisa noticed it more and more. When she walked through the sand, it didn't swallow her feet like it did the others. It felt soft, almost supportive, as if the earth itself carried her steps. Meanwhile, Bango's horses struggled to move through the thickening dunes. His soldiers complained that their boots sank too deep, slowing them down. Bango roared at them, his voice echoing through the fortress. But even his anger couldn't change what was happening. One evening, during a grand feast, Bango sat on his high throne, pretending nothing was wrong. He demanded wine and roasted meat, trying to prove he still controlled everything. Kalisa stood quietly in the corner, unnoticed as always, her eyes watching. When Bango reached for his drink, the goblet crumbled to dust in his hand. The room fell silent. His men stared, unsure whether to laugh or run. Bango's face twisted in fury, his voice booming as he accused his servants of trickery. But they were just as terrified as he was. His voice grew hoarse, dry from thirst, and his once powerful presence seemed smaller somehow. Kalisa felt the desert hum beneath her feet again, a low, comforting vibration that filled her with a strange, quiet calm. The winds outside began to howl, louder than ever before. Sand scraped against the fortress walls, sounding like 1,000 whispers calling her name. Kalisa didn't know why, but she wasn't afraid. The desert wasn't angry with her. It felt protected, like an old friend waking up after a long sleep. Bango, though, was different. He shouted into the storm, daring the desert to come for him. His voice was full of arrogance, but Kalisa saw something else in his desperation. He couldn't stop what was happening. The desert wasn't listening to him anymore. Kalisa didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. Bango was no longer the most powerful force in the desert. The sands had started to shift, and they weren't moving for him. They were moving for her. The desert winds grew wilder with each passing day, and the whispers in the sand turned into howls. It started with one man. Bango had sent him out to check the outer walls of the fortress during a rising sandstorm. The man never came back. At first, Bango assumed he had gotten lost, or perhaps fled, though no one dared run from Bango. Still, the desert was unforgiving, and people who wandered into it rarely returned. The next day, another man disappeared, this time a seasoned warrior who had been with Bango for years. He was sent to retrieve supplies from a nearby outpost, but when the winds picked up, he vanished too. No horse returned, no supplies, no body, just endless dunes stretching as far as the eye could see. Bango was furious. He accused the remaining soldiers of cowardice, shouting that they were running from him like weaklings, but his men didn't look afraid of Bango anymore. They were afraid of the desert. The storms became more frequent, rolling in without warning. They came fast and fierce, blotting out the sun and turning the sky a sickly shade of yellow. Each time the winds howled through the fortress, more men disappeared. Sometimes they were outside, guarding the gates or tending to the camels. Other times they were inside the walls, only to be gone when the storm passed, leaving nothing but their weapons behind, half buried in the sand. Whispers spread among the remaining soldiers. They spoke in hushed voices, afraid Bango would hear. They said the desert wasn't just a place anymore. It was alive, angry, and hunting them. Some swore they heard voices in the wind calling their names. Others said they saw figures in the sand, shadows moving just beyond sight. One man claimed he woke up in the middle of the night to find his bunkmate gone. The only sign of him, a trail of sand leading from his bed to the window. Bango refused to believe it. He stood before his men, roaring that they were fools, that no storm could take his warriors. But his voice didn't carry the way it used to. It was hoarse from thirst and shaking with something he couldn't hide: fear. Kalisa watched from the shadows, unnoticed as always. She saw the way Bango's hands trembled when he thought no one was looking, how his eyes darted to the windows whenever the wind picked up. He was trying to hold on to his power, but it was slipping through his fingers like the desert sand itself. One night, the worst storm yet rolled in. The sky went black, and the wind screamed so loud it sounded like the desert itself was crying out for revenge. The walls of the fortress groaned under the force of it, and sand blasted through every crack and crevice. Bango ordered his men to stay inside, but panic spread through them like wildfire. They didn't want to die trapped in the fortress. A few of them tried to run, believing they could escape the storm. Kalisa watched from her tiny corner as they disappeared into the swirling sands. Their silhouettes faded, swallowed by the desert, until they were gone completely. No screams, no sounds, just gone. When the storm finally died, Bango staggered out to find only emptiness. His once mighty army was shrinking faster than he could replace them. The men who remained were hollow-eyed and quiet, no longer loyal, just trapped, waiting for their turn to disappear. Bango's voice, once powerful and commanding, now sounded thin and desperate. He blamed Kalisa. He stared at her with suspicion, as if somehow she was connected to the desert's wrath, but even he didn't dare touch her anymore. The wind seemed to hum whenever she walked by, and the sand no longer clung to her skin the way it did to everyone else. The desert was angry, and it wasn't done yet. Bango's fortress, once filled with the sound of clashing swords and roaring laughter, had fallen into a hollow, unsettling silence. His men were disappearing faster than he could count. Each morning brought the same grim reality: fewer soldiers, fewer horses, and more sand seeping into every corner of his kingdom like an unwelcome guest. His once loyal warriors now moved like ghosts, their eyes sunken, their faces pale with fear. They avoided looking at him and whispered among themselves, voices trembling. No one dared say it aloud, but Bango knew what they were thinking. The desert was cursed, and Kalisa was at the heart of it. He watched her more closely now. She moved through the fortress with an eerie calm, her steps light, her eyes steady. The winds that howled and screamed at his windows seemed to quiet when she walked past. The sand never clung to her skin like it did to his men. It was as if the desert itself obeyed her. He hated her for it. He wanted to see her broken, begging for mercy, but instead she looked stronger. Bango's anger burned hotter than the desert sun, but underneath it, fear coiled like a snake. He wanted to kill her. He wanted to end whatever strange curse had taken hold of his land. His fingers itched to wrap around her throat, to watch the light fade from her eyes, but something held him back. A voice, small and unwelcome, whispered in the back of his mind. What if killing her made it worse? The desert was already punishing him. His men were gone. His horses, once proud and powerful, lay dead in the sand. His food supplies were running low, and the water that once flowed freely in his fortress dried up faster than it could be replenished. Even his gold, his greatest pride, seemed to sink deeper into the sand with each passing day, as if the earth itself wanted to swallow his riches. If he killed Kalisa, the girl who walked untouched through the storm, what would the desert do then? Would it stop, or would it consume him entirely? He paced his chambers at night, unable to sleep. The wind howled outside. A sound that once made him feel powerful now felt like it was mocking him. He imagined Kalisa standing in the dark corners of the fortress, her eyes glowing with the desert's light, controlling the very sand that stripped him of everything. He shook the thought from his head, but it came back again and again. He tried to find another way. He brought in healers, mystics, anyone who claimed to know about curses and desert spirits. Each one looked at Kalisa and then at him with the same fearful eyes. They muttered about old magic, ancient forces that no man could control. One old woman, her voice shaking, told him the desert didn't want Kalisa dead. It wanted her free. Bango's fury exploded. He struck the old woman down, but her words stayed with him. circling his mind like vultures. He couldn't kill Kalisa. He hated her more than anything in the world, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the moment her blood hit the sand, the desert would rise up and take him too. So he let her live, not out of mercy. Bango didn't believe in mercy, but out of fear. His once great power now felt like a prison. He was trapped in his own fortress, surrounded by walls of sand that grew taller every day. And Kalisa, the orphan girl he once called weak, walked among the ruins like she belonged there. Bango's desperation clawed at him. He didn't know what terrified him more, the thought that the desert would kill him if he harmed her, or the possibility that Kalisa didn't need the desert's help to destroy him after all. Kalisa felt it before she understood it. The desert wasn't just watching her anymore, it was protecting her. The winds that screamed and tore at the fortress walls grew quiet when she stepped outside. The sand that swallowed Bango's men and buried his riches moved gently around her feet, never rising against her. She walked through the shifting dunes without sinking, her footsteps leaving no trace behind. It was as if the desert wanted her to move unseen, untouched. At first, she thought it was luck, but luck didn't explain how the wind seemed to whisper to her, guiding her through the maze of crumbling stone and endless sand. It didn't explain how she no longer felt the blistering heat or the biting cold of the desert nights. The sun didn't burn her skin. The wind didn't sting her eyes. When the storms came, the sand swirled around her like a protective veil, shielding her while Bango's soldiers were dragged away, screaming into the dark. She tested it one night. While Bango paced his chambers in desperation, Kalisa slipped outside the fortress walls. The desert stretched before her, vast and endless. The wind picked up, tugging at her hair and clothes. But it wasn't angry. It felt alive, like an old friend greeting her. She stepped forward, expecting to sink into the dunes like she always had, but she didn't. The sand held her weight, firm and steady, while the wind circled her ankles like a playful child. She took another step, and another. The desert moved with her, guiding her steps. For the first time, Kalisa didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt free. The next day, she noticed something else. The guards no longer noticed her. They passed by without a glance, their eyes glazed and hollow with fear. She moved through the fortress like a shadow, quiet and invisible. It wasn't just that they were too afraid to look at her. It was as if the desert itself made them forget she was there. She grew bolder. She wandered further into the dunes, past the crumbling edges of Bango's fortress. The desert stretched endlessly, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like home. She listened to the wind, and it seemed to hum in her ears, soft and familiar. She couldn't explain how, but she understood it now. When she whispered to the wind, it listened. When she moved, it followed. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the dunes in gold and fire, she stood at the edge of the fortress walls and looked back at the place that had once felt like a prison. She wasn't afraid anymore. Bango's anger, his cruelty, it didn't matter. He couldn't touch her now. The desert wouldn't let him. Inside the fortress, Bango raged louder than ever. His voice echoed through the halls, furious and broken. He screamed her name, blaming her for everything. The lost men, the endless storms, the sand swallowing his riches. Kalisa listened, but his voice didn't scare her anymore. He sounded smaller now, weaker. The great desert lord, feared by all, was falling apart, and she was still standing. For the first time in her life, Kalisa didn't feel powerless. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was something more. The desert wasn't punishing Bango for her sake. It was lifting her up. She didn't know why, but she didn't need to. She felt it in her bones, in the way the sand moved and the wind sang to her. She wasn't his servant anymore. She wasn't anyone's servant. The desert had chosen her, and she wasn't afraid to let it. The storm came without warning. One moment, the sky was clear and blazing with the unforgiving desert sun. The next, the wind howled like a wounded beast, and the horizon disappeared beneath a wall of swirling sand. The fortress groaned under the force of it, the old stone walls trembling, as though the desert itself was trying to tear them down. Bango's men scrambled in panic, their shouts drowned by the screaming wind. They bolted the gates and slammed the shutters, but sand still poured in through the cracks. stinging their eyes and filling their lungs. Bango roared at them to hold their positions, but even his voice, once so powerful, was lost in the storm. Fear had taken root in his fortress, and no amount of shouting could stop it now. Kalisa was locked in the deepest part of the prison, her cell nothing more than a hole carved into cold stone. The iron door was heavy and rusted, the air thick and stale, but Kalisa wasn't afraid. She could feel the storm even down there, thrumming in her chest like a heartbeat. The desert wasn't angry with her. It was calling to her. She could hear it whispering through the cracks in the walls. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like the desert was waiting for her. The storm howled louder, the fortress shaking harder. Dust and sand rained down from the ceiling, coating her hair and skin. The iron door groaned as if it, too, was tired of holding her captive. Kalisa stood slowly, her heart steady, and stepped forward. The desert's hum grew louder, a low vibration that seemed to echo inside her. The wind pushed harder against the walls, and then, with a sound like thunder, the door burst open. It didn't creak. It didn't splinter. It exploded off its hinges, crashing to the ground with a deafening clang. Kalisa didn't flinch. She stepped over it, the wind rushing into the cell to greet her, swirling around her feet like an old friend. She walked through the prison halls, untouched by the chaos. The storm raged through the fortress now, pouring in through broken windows and shattered doors. Sand flooded the corridors, burying Bango's once grand tapestries and golden treasures. His guards, blinded and choking, didn't even see Kalisa as she passed. They stumbled past her, desperate to escape the relentless storm, never realizing the girl they feared was walking free among them. The wind guided her, pulling her toward the open courtyard. The air was thick with swirling sand, the sun completely gone. It was as if the world outside had been swallowed whole. But Kalisa wasn't afraid. She stepped into the storm, and the sand parted around her like a wave. The wind didn't push against her. It carried her forward, her feet never sinking into the dune. Behind her, Bango screamed her name. His voice was raw with rage and fear, echoing through the fortress like a dying man's last cry. He couldn't see her. He could barely see his own hands through the sand. He shouted again, his voice cracking, but Kalisa didn't stop. She didn't look back. The desert embraced her. The storm howled louder, as if to cover her escape. The wind wrapped around her like a cloak, and in an instant she was gone, swallowed by the sands, disappearing into the endless, shifting dunes. When the storm finally died, the fortress was half buried, and Kalisa's cell was empty. Bango searched every corner of his ruined stronghold, his fury turning to desperation. His men wouldn't meet his eyes. They were too afraid, not of him, but of the desert, and of the girl it had chosen to protect. Kalisa was gone, and deep down, Bango knew she wasn't coming back. Not yet. The desert no longer tolerated Bango. The storms didn't stop after Kalisa vanished. They grew worse. The wind screamed louder, the sand rose higher, and the sun seemed to burn hotter each day. His fortress, once a symbol of power and fear, now looked more like a graveyard. The walls were cracked and crumbling, with sand piling up inside the great hall where he once held feasts. His men, those who hadn't fled or been swallowed by the storms, were little more than hollow shells, their eyes sunken and lifeless. They stopped speaking, stopped fighting. They barely even moved, as though they were waiting for the desert to take them too. The camels, strong and resilient creatures that had once carried his armies across endless dunes, began to fall one by one. First they grew weak, refusing to eat or drink. Then they collapsed in the sand, their bodies shriveling under the relentless sun. No matter how much water Bango poured into their troughs, it dried up before they could drink it. The air itself seemed to steal the moisture away. One morning, Bango woke to find the last of his prized camels lying dead near the gate, its eyes wide and unblinking, its mouth filled with sand. His food supplies rotted faster than they should. His grain, carefully stored in sealed barrels, turned to dust. meat spoiled overnight, crawling with maggots despite the dry heat. The water in his wells tasted bitter and foul, making his men too sick to eat even what little food remained. Bango himself grew gaunt. His skin stretched tight over his once powerful frame. His clothes hung loose on his body, and his eyes burned red from the constant sand and sleepless nights. The worst came when the desert took his gold. Bango's treasure hoard, the source of his pride and power, was stored deep within the fortress. Mountains of gold coins, glittering jewels, and ornate weapons from conquered lands. One morning, he went to his vault to count his riches, to remind himself he was still powerful. But when he pushed open the heavy iron door, he found only sand. His gold was gone, replaced by dunes that had crept in overnight, swallowing his fortune whole. He screamed and dug through the sand with his bare hands, his nails breaking and bleeding as he clawed desperately for even a single coin. But there was nothing. The desert had taken it all. The fortress groaned like a dying beast. Stones began to fall from the walls, crashing down in clouds of dust. Towers that once reached toward the sky cracked and crumbled, their broken pieces swallowed by the ever-growing dunes. Sand poured in through every crack and window, filling rooms and hallways, burying everything he had built. Bango's men, what few were left, stopped listening to him. They didn't care about his orders anymore. They barely even acknowledged him. Some wandered into the desert, never to return. Others sat silently, waiting for the end. Bango, once the mighty desert lord feared by all, was now a broken, desperate man. His voice, once booming and full of power, was hoarse and weak. He wandered his ruined fortress alone, muttering to himself, his eyes wild. He stopped calling for his men. He stopped shouting for Kalisa. He knew no one was coming to save him. The desert wasn't done yet. The final storm came in the dead of night, more powerful than anything before it. The wind howled like 1,000 voices screaming for vengeance. Sand slammed against what was left of the fortress, tearing through stone and wood alike. Walls collapsed. The roof of the great hall caved in with a thunderous roar, burying the last remnants of Bango's past glory. His banners, once bright and bold, were torn to shreds and scattered into the wind. Bango stood in the center of the ruin, his face caked with dirt, his body trembling. He looked to the sky, but the stars were gone, hidden behind the swirling sand. He fell to his knees, coughing and choking on the dust. His kingdom was gone, his power stripped away. The desert had taken everything. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie golden glow over the endless sea of sand. The wind, once wild and furious, now whispered gently, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. From the horizon, a figure emerged, small at first, but steady, moving with purpose. It was Kalisa. She was no longer the frightened, helpless girl Bango had once bought and broken. The desert had shaped her into something else, something stronger. She walked with the grace of the wind and the weight of the sand beneath her feet, untouched by the heat or the dust swirling around her. Her clothes, once ragged and torn, now flowed like desert silk, the colours blending with the dunes. Her hair, once matted and dirty from Bango's prison, now fell in waves down her back, shining in the sunlight. But it was her eyes that had changed the most. They no longer held fear or pain. They burned with quiet, steady power, the kind of power Bango could never understand. The fortress that once stood proud and mighty was now nothing more than a broken shell, half buried in sand. The once great towers leaned awkwardly, their tops shattered. The banners that once flew with Bango's sigil were gone, ripped to pieces by the storms. The gates, once guarded by fierce warriors, hung off their hinges, creaking in the wind. The air smelled of dust and death. Kalisa stepped through the ruins, her bare feet leaving no trace in the sand. She moved through the empty halls where Bango had once paraded his wealth and power, where she had once been forced to kneel at his feet. The walls, now cracked and crumbling, felt smaller than she remembered. The echoes of his cruel laughter seemed like distant ghosts. Powerless now, she found him in the courtyard, slumped against a pillar that barely stood. Bango was barely recognizable. His once massive frame, full of strength and arrogance, was now thin and hollow. His skin, once bronzed and proud, was pale and cracked from the sun. His clothes hung loose, dirty and torn. His eyes, once blazing with fury, were dull and sunken. He didn't look like a powerful desert lord anymore. He looked like a man who had been swallowed whole and spit back out by the very land he once ruled. He didn't notice her at first. His head hung low, his breathing shallow. The wind tugged at his hair, but he didn't move. Still alive, Bango. Kalisa's voice was calm, steady, not the trembling, frightened voice he remembered. His head snapped up. His eyes widened, but there was no strength behind them, only disbelief. For a moment he stared at her like he was seeing a ghost. His voice came out, weak and broken. You're alive." Kalisa tilted her head. "I am. The desert let me live. It didn't show you the same mercy." Bango coughed, a dry, painful sound. He tried to push himself up, but his arms shook and gave out beneath him. He slumped back against the pillar, gasping, "Please, help me. The desert, it took everything. My men, my gold, everything." His voice cracked. "I have nothing left." Kalisa stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't feel hatred, not anymore. What she felt was something deeper, colder. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a broken man, hollow and empty, paying the price for his cruelty. "You took everything from me first," she said softly, "but I'm still here." Bango's voice was barely a whisper now. "Please, mercy." Kalisa stared at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she turned her back on him and walked away, leaving him to the desert's judgment. The wind stirred around her, warm and gentle, carrying her forward. Behind her, Bango's raspy, desperate voice called out one last time, "Kalisa, please." She didn't look back. The desert had already decided his fate. Bango's voice cracked, raw and broken, as he begged Kalisa for mercy. His once powerful body trembled, too weak to lift himself from the sand. His eyes, once blazing with cruelty and arrogance, were now hollow, filled with a fear he couldn't hide. He wasn't a desert lord anymore. He was just a man, broken, starving, and left with nothing. Kalisa stood before him, her gaze steady and unwavering. She wasn't the frightened girl he had bought and abused. The desert had changed her, shaped her into something more. The wind moved around her like a gentle whisper, tugging at her clothes, rustling her hair. The sand didn't dare touch her. It moved at her will, waiting for her to decide his fate. Bango coughed, spitting sand from his mouth. His voice came out in a rasp. "Please, Kalisa, don't leave me. I'm sorry for everything. Help me." His voice cracked again, weaker this time. "Please." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the kind of silence that felt heavy, final. She remembered everything, the beatings, the humiliation, the nights she cried herself to sleep on the cold stone floor of his prison. She remembered the fear, the helplessness. He had stolen her childhood, her freedom, her very name. And yet, she felt no rage now, no hatred. The man before her wasn't the monster she remembered. He was pathetic, hollow, a shell of the powerful figure who once controlled her life. He wasn't worth her anger. He wasn't worth her hate. "You don't deserve mercy," she said quietly, her voice steady and calm. "But I won't kill you. The desert will decide what happens to you now." Bango's eyes widened with panic. He tried to crawl toward her, his hands clawing weakly at the sand, but his limbs shook too much to carry him. His body collapsed, too weak to rise. "No, please, don't leave me here. Kalisa, please." His voice broke into a desperate sob. Kalisa didn't flinch. She didn't look back. She turned and walked away, her steps light and soundless, leaving him in the sand. The wind stirred again, rising gently at first. The desert seemed to breathe with her, following her lead. Each step she took felt like a release, from her pain, her past, and from him. Behind her, Bango's cries grew more frantic. He called her name over and over, his voice raw and desperate. The wind swallowed his words, carrying them away. The sand began to shift, slowly at first, then faster. The dunes trembled, the earth beneath him loosening. He struggled, trying to crawl free, but the sand pulled at him like invisible hands. It dragged him down grain by grain, swallowing his legs, his arms. "No, no, please!" Bango screamed, his voice barely rising over the wind. He thrashed, but it was useless. The more he fought, the deeper he sank. The sand didn't care about his power, his fear, or his pleas. The desert had waited long enough. Kalisa didn't stop walking. She never looked back. She didn't need to. The wind howled louder, and the sand surged forward, rushing over him like a wave. Bango's screams were cut off abruptly, his voice lost beneath the shifting dunes. The desert swallowed him whole, leaving nothing but an empty stretch of sand where he once knelt. It was as if he had never existed. Kalisa walked on, the sun setting behind her, casting long shadows over the dunes. The wind hummed softly now, no longer angry, almost like it was singing to her. She wasn't a slave anymore. She wasn't broken. She was free, and the desert was hers.